All right, let's dive right into one of the most incredible and, frankly, dramatic legal battles in all of American history. It's the story of a schooner called La Amistad.
So, picture this. It's August 1839. This mysterious ship just appears off the coast of Long Island. I mean, nobody knows where it came from. And when they get on board, it's just a shocking scene. And the discovery of this single, strange vessel, well, it kicked off a chain of events that would literally challenge the very foundations of justice here in the United States. Okay, so Section 1, a mysterious ship. Now, when the U.S. brig Washington seized the Amistad, the crew probably thought it was a pretty standard day's work. What they didn't know was that they just stumbled into a story that didn't begin in American waters at all, but thousands of miles away.
And at the very heart of this whole affair is this man, Joseph Cinque. And it's so important to understand this. He wasn't born into slavery. Not at all. He was a free man, a rice farmer from what we now call Sierra Leone. He had a wife, 3 kids, a whole life that was stolen from him when he was illegally captured.
So Cinque and 52 other Africans were caught up in the illegal Atlantic slave trade. And when I say illegal, I mean it. This wasn't just some moral gray area. The practice had been banned for decades by international treaties and by Spain itself. Their journey across the Atlantic was just a complete nightmare. A third of the captives died on that first ship. When the survivors got to Cuba, they were sold illegally to a couple of Spanish plantation owners and then herded onto the Amistad for what was supposed to be a short trip to a plantation.
Section 2, Rebellion on the High Seas. But here's the thing. That final journey, it never finished. Just 4 days out from Havana, the captives on the Amistad made a choice. They decided they were not going to be slaves. They were going to fight for their freedom right then and there.
And that's exactly what they did. Cinque found a loose file, broke his chains, and led the revolt. They seized control of the ship. Now here's a key detail. They spared the lives of their captors, Ruiz and Montes, but on one condition: sail us back to Africa. Take us home. The Spaniards agreed, sort of. By day, they'd sail east towards Africa, but at night, they'd secretly turn the ship and steer north. This went on for 2 months, this zigzag of deception, until they didn't end up in Africa. They ended up right off the coast of the United States.
Section 3, a nation divided. So after being taken ashore in Connecticut, the Africans were thrown in jail, and their case immediately became this huge national spectacle. It just completely divided the country. You know, the whole legal fight really boiled down to 2 completely different versions of reality. On one side, you had the U.S. and Spanish governments saying, look, this is just a property dispute. These Africans are slaves, they're property, and a treaty says we have to return them. Pretty straightforward, right? But on the other side, you had the abolitionists who were saying, no, you've got it all wrong. These are free men who are kidnapped. Their papers are fake. And that rebellion, that wasn't murder. That was an act of self-defense. All right, Section 4, the President versus Adams. As you can imagine, this wasn't just some local court case for long. It escalated fast and ended up pitting the full power of the White House against one of America's most respected figures. So you've got President Merton Van Buren, and he's really worried. He's up for re-election, and he is terrified of losing support from the southern states. So his administration jumps in and actively tries to obstruct justice. I mean, they're siding completely with the Spanish claim that even intentionally mistranslated Spanish documents to try and fool the court. And get this, Van Buren had a Navy ship on standby, ready to immediately deport the Africans back to Cuba the second the court ruled against them, before they could even think about filing an appeal.
But the abolitionists, they had a heavy hitter in their corner. They managed to get former President John Quincy Adams to argue the case. Now, you got to remember who this guy was. He's 74 years old at this point. He's the son of a founding father, John Adams. He's basically the country's last living political link to the entire revolutionary generation. This was a huge deal. And in the middle of all this legal chaos, a letter gets written to John Quincy Adams from an 11-year-old boy on the Amistad named Cale. And all it said was, "All we want is make us free." I mean, wow, that simple, powerful plea just cut through everything, all the politics, all the legal jargon. It gave the Africans a voice, and it perfectly captured what this was all about. Section 5, the Supreme Court's verdict. So eventually, this whole thing lands in front of the Supreme Court. This is it, the final showdown. And let's be honest, the odds seemed completely stacked against the Africans. Why were the odds so bad? Well, think about this. Of the 9 justices on the Supreme Court at the time, 5 of them, a majority, were Southerners who owned slaves themselves. That includes the Chief Justice. So yeah, their fate rested in the hands of men who were part of the very system they were fighting against.
But then Adams stood up. And over 2 days, for a total of 9 hours, he gave this absolutely passionate, brilliant defense. He argued that what happened on that ship wasn't murder. It was, in his words, the justice of heaven. He said these men had every right, a natural right, to fight back against their illegal captors.
And then, the verdict came down on March 9th, 1841, in a decision that I think stunned a lot of people. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Africans. They were declared free individuals who had been illegally kidnapped. The court's official opinion, written by Justice Joseph Story, really affirmed this idea. It said that all human beings have an ultimate right to resist oppression and to apply force against ruinous injustice. They weren't property, they weren't pirates, they were free people who had been unlawfully captured. Okay, Section 6, a complicated legacy. Now this was a huge landmark victory for sure, but the story doesn't just end with a happy verdict. The case's legacy is, well, it's a lot more complicated than you might think. So after all that, after fighting so hard to enslave them, the U.S. government refused to pay a dime to send them home. So abolitionists had to raise private funds to get the 35 survivors back to Sierra Leone. But for Cinque, the homecoming was just tragic. He found his village destroyed by war and learned his entire family had been sold into slavery. He escaped one nightmare, only to find another.
And this is where we get to the real paradox of the Amistad decision. You see, the court was incredibly careful with its wording. It said this was an exceptional case. Why? Because these men were free Africans who were illegally kidnapped. The ruling did not, and they made this very clear, grant a general right for enslaved people already in the U.S. to rebel. So, in a strange, twisted way, by freeing these specific men, the court actually reinforced the legal framework of slavery for everyone else.
And that leaves us with this final, lingering question. The Amistad case was, without a doubt, a victory for freedom. But by declaring it a one-off, an exception, did the ruling ultimately strengthen the very institution of slavery it seemed to challenge? It's a tough question, and it really makes you think about how a single legal victory can exist right alongside a much larger, ongoing injustice.